All right, our show this evening is on the subject of the early years of the Triplett Corporation. Now, to tell this story, I have to tell the story virtually of my father, R.L. Triplett, who founded the company. So let's take a step back in history to a point in time in Bluffton when just 11 years ago Bluffton got its first railroad. And in a dozen years it was going to be in a mini oil boom. And the automobile was just emerging. And along came 4 years ago, along came a guy called Thomas Edison. And what is he noted for?
Light bulb.
Okay, he's noted for the light bulb. You're right. And what is not generally publicized is not only did he give us the light bulb, but he also gave us the practical way to generate the power for that light bulb and to distribute it. And that was the beginning of the spread of electricity. Well, into the scene comes R.L. Triplett. And as you can see, in a few years he mastered the dress to be correct, the correct dress for what is it, the socially correct dress. Well, as he grew up, he became fascinated with this thing called electricity. And in his high school years, he wired several homes and also helped wire the first building at the college hall. And his graduation speech from high school was the electrical age. Now, also during his high school years, he repaired watches for D.C. Bixel. And I know you're going to ask, well, what does that have to do with electricity? Well, really nothing, but in this case, it has a lot to do with it. Well, this young man wanted to go on to further education, but neither he nor his folks had any money. So instead he went to the big city of Chicago and found a job in a company that made, of all things, electrical instruments. Well, he was there only 2 years when he got a telegram that his mother had died. So he returned to Bluffton, and in spite of the requests of the Chicago outfit to have him return there, he stayed in Bluffton. And that was a benchmark year, 1904. In that year, Oh Kindly Dave, that was D.C. Bixel, arranged for some space in the back of his watch store for R.L. to design his first meter. And that was the first meter, and he called it the Pocket Meter Company. And can you imagine why would he put it in a case like that? Well, that was a pocket watch case. Unheard of in those days to put a meter in the case like that. And so that was very unique and practical. Now you probably want to ask, what does a meter do? Well, that one you just saw before.
Back button.
If you That meter obviously didn't work because we had to even scrounge up parts just to make it so we could take a picture of that. So it didn't work, but here's one that does work. This one is quite a few years later, but it's still about 80 years old.
Wow.
And still in good condition and still works fine. So what does a meter do? You see where that needle is? It's on pointing to 0. Well, now if we want to measure just a common ordinary 9-volt battery, you see the needle runs up to 9 volts. And that's what meters do. They just measure electricity in one form or another. Well, at that time, as I say, the automobile was just coming on board. And that little meter that you saw, the pocket meter, was just a ticket, because in those days they did not have the rechargeable battery like we have today. Instead, they ran the ignition on oversized flashlight batteries. And you can imagine that they would run down. So now with RL's handy-dandy pocket meter, there just was no excuse for a young man who was taking his girl out for a spin to have the engine die on a lonely road.
At least that's what Mom told you.
So cramping. Cost it.
Well,
Opposite of a baby thing.
a business friend of RL's came to him and said, you know, you ought to form a company, because that pocket meter was just a name. It wasn't really a company. And so they got together and formed a partnership. 5 local Bluffton people formed a partnership, not incorporated, but they called it the Triplett Meter Company, and that's actually a letterhead from that company. These were the 5 people. Now, N.W. Cunningham, most of you won't know these people, but N.W. Cunningham was the president of the local commercial bank.
Evan's grandfather.
Oh, okay.
And their purpose was to see that the little business got started and then bow out. So he did, and he sold his interest to Peter Diller, who doesn't mean anything to you folks either.
Oh, yes. Phyllis Diller's dad.
Phyllis Diller's
Father-in-law.
father-in-law. Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, so here we have Peter Diller, basically. R.L. H.O. Frederick was Peter Diller's brother-in-law. Waldo Diller was Peter Diller's son. So it's basically a Diller Triplett partnership. And this Henry Aldhouse came on by invitation of R.L. because he had done work for the pocket meter company but would never take any pay. So R.L. arranged for him to be one of the partners. Well, soon after they formed, this was in 1906, they bought a building across from Harmon Field, where the stadium is. Some of you know where that is. And I presume these are some of the workers there. they look, I think they're on break right now.
Hope so.
Hope so.
But it was here that R.L. tried to design a meter that would read and also write that thing on a piece of paper. Well, he never got the meter in production, but he got the idea of read and writing, and so he coined the name Read Write, and that name became a very, very famous name. Well, now, this partnership that I spoke about was basically a Diller Triplett relationship. Diller was on R.L.'s board, and R.L. was on Diller. Diller had a cream separator business, which changed its name to the Diller Manufacturing Company, and it was incorporated. So the two of them said, well, you know, we better have Read-Write operate under the umbrella of the corporation. So they merged together, and the name of the company was Diller Manufacturing Company. They making their product and Read-Write making their product. Now, an interesting sidelight on this was that Diller was making cream separators, and that business died out, and they went into the fireless cooker business. Now, people around town have seen some of these. What it is it's a kettle up there, as you see, and down the bottom are stones, which are heated on a gas stove. One stone's put in the bottom of the kettle, and food's put on top of that, and then another heated stone on top of that. And the box is a well-insulated box, and it slow cooks the food, just like a crock pot. I guess this was the forerunner of the crock pot.
A little bigger.
Well, they had various sizes, but during World War I, the government ordered 20,000 of these for the to give hot meals to the frontline troops. They were quite sophisticated in this. They even had a recipe book. The recipe book is amazing. It covers everything from soup to roast beef to pudding, anything you want. Okay, Read-Write, while Diller was doing this, Read-Write was still making meters, and then along came another benchmark year, the 1920s. Anyone know what happened during those years?
Can I interrupt this
Charles
one?
age.
Bill, would 30 be better or 80?
Where are they?
They're in Chicago.
They were there
Wow.
4 hours ago.
They're gonna be lost. You better talk to them.
1920 was the year that Grandpa was born.
Benchmark
year.
So that's a monument year.
Okay, well, this was the emergence of radio. And radios in those days operated on batteries primarily. So here was Read-Write, an expert in the battery testing field. So they were right in there. But there was another weak element in radios at that time, and that was the radio tube. The tube would deteriorate just like a battery. Well, they didn't have transistors and microcircuits like we have today. They used a radio tube. But how are you going to test a radio tube? Well, now, if Read-Write was going to get into the radio market, they'd got to get in with both feet. So they got their heads together, and they came up with the world's first radio tube tester. And that big catalog house, Montgomery Ward, which was the large catalog house in those days, sold large quantities of these because radio at that time was a lot of people built them themselves. It was a sort of a do-it-yourself business. Well, Read-Write developed other test equipment. They really pioneered in the 20s in the radio field, all types of test equipment. That was probably the largest selling style of radio testers. And you see they were used in the home, the do-it-yourselfers. Well, Read-Write grew, and they, in 1928, added that big addition you see on the back there to the little frame building they had. They had previously added the stone building, but that was what we all knew in Bluffton as the Read-Write Meter Works
So that's on
on College Avenue.
that's
Not
still across.
anymore.
That's
across from the Harmon Field.
Right.
Next to
This
the
is still-
tennis courts.
Yeah,
But
Yeah.
not there anymore,
Yeah.
parking lot now.
yeah.
Well, the 1928, then along comes the Depression years, but at the same time, RL invented a thing called a tuning meter. Now, radios, as you saw back quite some, has a lot of knobs and adjustments, and it's quite difficult to tune the station in accurately and quickly. So he invented this thing, and it was put in the radio, and by watching that needle, you could quickly tune in the station and tune it in accurately. Well, for a period of time, Read-Write produced 2,000 of those
In what
per
period?
day.
Per day.
2,000 a day of those tuning meters.
Wow.
Did they sell them?
Yeah, they sold them, and this was in the Depression.
We better not wake them up.
Well, RL saw that radio was becoming more and more sophisticated. Engineers needed more precision equipment. The production people needed more precision equipment. The service people did. And so, in 1932, another benchmark year, he started a company, and a second company, and called it the Triplett Electrical Instrument Company. And that's probably the first meter that they built. But the success of that meter was that they, the meters that, the precision meters at that time were very clumsy and difficult to build, and therefore quite high priced. So he got his gang together, and he always credits the George Clydes as being the mechanical geniuses. Well, you don't know George Clyde, but those Clydes around town were mechanical geniuses, as he called them.
Huh.
And they came up with a mechanism that was far simpler than available, so therefore less costly. And it found favor in the industry very rapidly.
Why did he feel he needed to start a separate company to do this?
Well, okay, that's a good question. Read-Write was in, I'm going to say it's in the indicating business, and Triplett went to the precision thing, which we call the measuring business. They actually were two separate markets.
But the Read-Write was known for just kind of an indicator, low end type performance.
Yeah,
Sure,
and
they wanted a separate company to set it apart as a high quality precision.
I think that's basically it. Yeah. Okay, continuing on. This in 1934, even during the Depression, was a picture of the Read-Write and Triplett people that they were all in one building at that time.
Is it mostly male or female or?
Some of them have dresses on.
That doesn't answer the question.
Talk about why you got the
Very Paul.
Yeah, A lot tell- of them look like that. Dad, explain about the way this picture was taken.
Okay, to take a picture that wide, apparently they didn't have a wide angle camera, so the picture, the photographer started at the left-hand side of the picture and slowly moved over across to the right. That's the reason the building in the back looks curved, but I don't know why the people look straight. At any rate, there was a fellow by the name of Herman Schmidt. He was on the complete left side, got his picture taken, and when he saw that camera moving, he ducked down and got on the right side. So he's on the right, on both the left and the right side.
At Washington D.C. Wait, where is he now?
We don't know which one he is.
But whichever one's up there twice.
But yeah, if you look at it real carefully.
Well, this was
Get out of
19.
loop, Dad.
This was 1934, and 1 year later, Triplett decided they had to make their own building,
Look at that.
and this was in a cow pasture there on Harmon Field. But this building was really state of the art for that time of period. This building was the first factory in the area, and I would suggest that probably one of the very few in the country that was air conditioned. For a factory in those days to be air conditioned was quite unusual. Another thing they had was the first in this area was the paid rest break. That just wasn't common in those days at all. And I think another thing that was unique, lighting was, the fluorescent light was not yet available, and the indoor lighting wasn't that great, so the walls were glass instead of the concrete as normal. But this way they got the natural lighting in. And another feature they had, which I think was unique also, they arranged for the rotation of jobs where the job was tedious or stressful, so the person didn't have to stay on that type of job all day long.
So was the motivation for the air conditioning and the paid breaks and that, what was the motivation for that? Was that
I can't tell you the motivation, but it was just a thing they did. It wasn't a competitive motivation, because I don't think any others did.
Was he specifically very concerned about the well-being of the workers?
Well, for one thing, of course, it had to be a clean, lighted atmosphere as far as the product was concerned. And there were tedious jobs in there. So I think that that was probably the motivation.
Well, I could see that if you had that wall of windows like that, the sun coming in would be pretty intense. I mean, Greg, you know what sort of game you get on something like that.
Thus the air conditioning is what you're saying?
That's what I'm saying, is that if you design it with that much window, you on a summer day you'd have to do something.
Well, you're right on that. Yeah.
And I bet I know another first. I bet they only worked 5.5 days a week.
Yeah.
Rather than the traditional 6 at the time. They probably quit on Saturday at noon. Right?
Yeah, I think
So
they
they
did.
get their haircuts.
Yeah, and get the lawn mowed. How
Okay.
many people do you think were employed there now?
Well, in 1930,
Tax base will count.
Yeah.
in that picture,
Yeah.
And then
That many
subtract
minus
one.
I have the original picture, and RL has on the back of it 245.
Wow.
Now that was in the
1934.
depth of the Depression, and everything. The banks were closing, and everything was going to pot. But Reedwright and Triplett were moving ahead, which I think speaks real well for. Well, they built Triplett then, separate from Reedwright, built all types and styles of meters, and they of course built all types of styles of test equipment, laboratory equipment. I mean, the meters were used in laboratories. And there's one that I bet you don't know what it is.
The animal computer.
Well, that's the trouble. You can read. That's an analog computer, which of course is long before the digital computer, but it required a meter to make all those adjustments. And I'll bet you that piece of equipment can do almost as many calculations as you can do on your 10 fingers.
Wow. Now was that Was that label on it or was that added on now?
What,
Tina
the label?